What is going on, everybody? In this sequence, we are going to be discussing the Petrov, which is e4, e5, knight f3, and then knight f6, the Russian game, or better as Miya stara rabota nochia minya roskamo. I used to work for some crazy fucking Russians and Ukrainians. They don't fucking play. Привет, babuska. So from here, you want to go ahead and capture the e5 pawn with your knight. And if they capture the e4 pawn, that's a mistake. It's dubious. What you can do is move your queen to e2, attacking that knight. And if they retreat the knight to any of the 4 squares on the north side of the knight, you have the awesome resource, knight c6, discover check on the king, and the knight attacks the queen. No matter what they do, if they block it, you pick up the queen, and if they block it with the queen, you still pick it up with the queen. They do have some other, I guess, ways to defend. Real quick, if they move to knight c3, capture with the knight. If they go knight g3, capture with the h-pawn. And if they either go d2 or f2, just continue with your plan. They got 3 other ways to go. They can move their queen to e7. If that's the case, you more or less just want to just capture the knight upright. And they can try pushing d6. And if they think that you're dumb enough to move the knight and leave the queen hanging, that's obviously not the way to go. You more or less want to just push your d-pawn to d4. And if they capture it, just let them. And I would say you recapture and go from there. If they don't bring out the queen, they can either try backing up their knight with the d-pawn or f-pawn. If they back it up with the d-pawn, push d3 and hit it back. And if they, if they bounce with it or, try putting the queen here, so when you capture their knight, they capture your knight, that's fine. You're going to end up a pawn ahead by capturing the d-pawn with your e-pawn. Both queens are pinned now. If they take yours, recapture with the bishop. If they fall back or whatever, just capture theirs, get it over with, and you're a pawn ahead. That's if they guard their knight with the d-pawn. It gets interesting when they back it up with the f-pawn, because you have the awesome resourceful move yet again, Queen h5. They got 2 options. If they block it with the pawn, you capture the pawn with your knight on g6. They can take your knight with the h-pawn and give up the rook in the corner. If they're trying to be slick with the move knight f6, hitting your queen, fall back to e2, checking them. Once they take care of the check, you pick up the rook. And if they don't block the check with the pawn, they can technically move with the king. And if that's the case, queen f7, check. They have 1 move, king d6. Fall back with the knight to c4, check. Now they got 2 moves. They got c5 and c6. c5 is a checkmate in 7. It starts off with pushing the d-pawn. They got several moves. They got c6. They got b5. They got b4. And they can even capture the d-pawn. If they capture the d-pawn, bishop e3 is a checkmate. We're not really going to go down the rabbit hole because, just for example, it says checkmate in 5. But if you go to lines, there's 4 different ways to do that, and let's pick one randomly. If you do one of them, there's just more. It just forks out. We'd be here doing 600 different variations. Ain't no one got time for that. So use your head, be smart. King's in the center of the board. You're 13 points ahead, according to the computer. Get her done. Hope you enjoyed that one. In this trap, it's very close and similar to the first trap we discussed. The knight will come and take the e5 pawn, and you go ahead and take the e4 pawn. And when the queen comes to e2, you push your queen on e7. They will snag your knight, and that's when you push d3. I'm sorry, d6. They will also back up their knight with d4, and when you capture the knight on e5, they will recapture the pawn on e5. You want to start piling on the attackers on that pawn. And the easiest one to start with is knight to c6. Other than pawns, they really only have one piece that they can add right away, and that's the bishop to f4. If they do, you can push the g pawn to g5 and get them falling for the trap. If they try to maintain the defense on the pawn and move back to g3, you actually can push f5 because they can't capture en passant because the queen would fall. So once they move their queen wherever they want to, let's say they fall back here, you push the f pawn again to f4, and now that bishop is trapped. Credit goes to Mr. Eric Rosen. You're the fucking man, bro. Hope to get as big as you one day. And that is the trap in this line. This is a very sneaky trap. Players of all levels fall for it. Knight captures the e5 pawn, and the d6 push kicks the knight. That's when black takes white's e4 pawn, and the queen comes to e2, pinning the knight. The queen comes to e7, unpinning it. That's when white can push d3, kicking the knight tit for tat. The knight will return to f6. We have a symmetrical setup. And white can play this subtle move, bishop e3. Standard developing move, knight to c6. And knight to c3. Now, if the bishop tries pinning the knight on f6, white can go ahead and make the bishop basically shit or get off the pot, more or less. So if the bishop backs up, that's really bad because now the g4 pawn will kick it again. Once the bishop finds its home on g6, that pawn will just keep on pushing. Now this knight has 3 logical options. It can go back to where it came from, which no one likes that. Knight on the rim is dim, or this innocent looking move, knight d7, and it looks like it's got plenty of other great spots it can jump from there, but it's too late because the c3 knight now jumps to d5, hitting the queen, and it's threatening to hit the c7 pawn, forking the king and rook. The only queen move which protects that pawn is queen d8, and that's when the rook gets hit by the knight and the king. So it's either lose the rook or capture the knight. Why wouldn't you? Well, if you knew better, you wouldn't, because you have the amazing move, bishop to b6, hitting the queen, and a discover check on the king. You can't resolve both, so you got to block the check or move the king, and once you do that, the bitch falls. Hoo-ha-ha. I got a lot to say in this trap, so we're going to move faster than normal. All right? Speedy Gonzalez here. In this trap, you do not take the pawn. You let them take your pawn by moving your bishop to c4. Once they capture your pawn, you want to develop your knight to c3, offering the exchange. If they take the exchange, you want to capture away from the middle to open things up with your d-pawn. From here, they got two options to guard their floating pawn on e5. Both of them are going to end badly. If they try their knight, this is not the trap, but I'm just showing you what happens if they choose the knight. You go ahead and move your knight to g5, threatening to fork on f7. Their only literally way to prevent that from happening is pushing d5 first. You capture that with your bishop, and then they have to move their bishop to e6. You want to capture the bishop here with your knight. Hey, they stopped you from attacking on f7 forking, but they're going to lose up their pawn structure. Once they capture their knight, you capture their knight. With a check, they have to do that. Then you bring in your queen to h5. They got two options. They can either run or block with the pawn on g. If they block with the pawn on g, you take the e5 pawn, threatening to hit the rook, and then they'd have to move it over. You're going to have a good game because it's fucked up. If they don't block with the pawn, they can run. If they go to e7, you can bring in the bishop to g5, hitting the g5. You skewer the king and the queen. If they move to d7, they got a decent game. All right, now that that's out of the way, if they don't guard the pawn with the knight, they can guard it with the pawn, and this is the trap I want to show you. So, just to show you again, from here, you develop your bishop, they take the pawn, you bring out your knight for the exchange, you capture towards the middle, and if they guard their pawn with the pawn, you're good to go. You bring your knight and you capture the pawn on e5. If and only if they capture your knight, you're golden, because you kamikaze on f7, and they can't take it, because if they take it, they leave their queen undefended and they lose it. Their only other option would be to run away to e7, but that doesn't work either, because then you bring your bishop to g5. Now their only move is literally capturing the light squared bishop, and then you can capture the queen with either the bishop or the queen. But I would feel guilty if I didn't tell you this one little thing. They don't have to take the knight with the pawn. They could try pinning your knight to your king. If they do that, you want to come in and you want to hit the queen with your bishop and kick it over. And when they kick it over, then you castle to undo the pin, because they can't capture your knight because the pawn is pinned. And they would be really, I mean, they always have the option to, from this position, they always have the option to, to take the two minors for the queen. But as we said, if they tried pinning it, you put your bishop here, you kick over the king, and then you castle. And they really can't take it with the knight, because then you'd move over your rook, and the top three engine moves are no bueno. Literally, their best options are either taking the rook, which you capture the rook with the queen, bringing the bishop to g4, hitting your queen, then you just capture the bishop with your rook. They can't recapture yet, so they would have to capture your queen. Once they do that, you bring your bishop to g5, checking the king. They really don't have many options. If they run, then you get the bishop. And if they block with the bishop, then you take it with the rook. And you're good. And basically, you're threatening next move. If they try to save the bishop or whatever, then you're threatening rook to e8. Forking the two. It's not good. And they can't kill the rook because they're in check with the bishop. So they would literally have to run to d7. And then you take the rook. Hope you enjoyed that. Wow, 4:15. See you. This next trap is short and sweet. When you capture their pawn on e5, they'll kick your knight by pushing d6, just swing it back to f3. And when it's their turn to take your pawn on e4, go ahead and develop your knight to c3. They don't have to take it. Sometimes they'll go ahead and back up their knight with a bishop. And if that's the case, move your queen to e2. That knight is pinned. Their best effort to save it is to march up the d-pawn. And that's when you just march up your d-pawn as well, hitting it. And there's literally nothing that they can do. They develop their knight, just before you capture it, you can either swing out your bishop and check the queen, or nothing's saying that you can't capture it right away. And after they recapture, you can really do whatever have you, because they can't capture your knight yet because it's pinned. They would have to develop their bishop and castle. So you won yourself a minor piece, and you'll have an excellent game. This trap is almost identical to the trap that opened up the video. When white captures the pawn on e5, black plays the Stafford Gambit by playing knight c6. If white captures the knight, black will recapture with the d-pawn to c6, and then white may try kicking the knight by pushing e5. The knight can jump freely to e4, and if white tries kicking the knight again, black can move their bishop to c5. Very similar in the mechanism, because if white captures the knight on e4, the bishop can take f2. And just like the trap for white that we discussed, if the king plays f2 capture, then they lose the queen. And if they only play their legally move other than that, bishop g4 solidifies the deal. And their only legal move would be to capture the dark squared bishop. And just like the first trap where white took black's queen, when black takes white queen, if you take with the bishop, it's actually worse here. In the first trap, it was better to take with the bishop. In this variation, it's better to take with the queen. And I will also mention that if white tries blocking with the bishop, you can go ahead and capture the bishop first. And when white recaptures, they can do the standard motif that we all should know at this level if you've made it this far watching this video. Check with queen h4, and if the king moves, then you have checkmate. And if the pawn goes to g3 to block, the knight can capture, and there's very little that white can do. If they capture with the pawn, then they lose the rook. The only other move I see would be, if they made the huge mistake of moving the rook, then, yeah, knight would jump to e4 with check. And like I said, if the king moved, it would be checkmate queen f2. And if they blocked with the rook now, the knight would what we do here? The queen would go ahead and take the pawn on h2, threatening checkmate. And the only way to stop the inevitable checkmate, they can try rook to g2. But if that was the case, to do checkmate, you got queen h4. If the king went to e2, then you have your bishop g4. The rook must capture, and then you have checkmate with queen f2. And other than that, what else does they have to try? If they go rook g3, then they have queen capture g3, then the king is forced to e2. Then you actually have two different checkmates. You got queen f2 checkmate, or you can go bishop g4 checkmate. Fancy, fancy. And the only other legal move that they have would be rook f2, and that would be an immediate checkmate by queen f2. So it's very similar to, like we said, the trap that white can set for black, but in this case, there's a checkmate if white messes around too much. So I hope you enjoyed it. This is a very nice trap for black to play, and I've never seen this one until the research I put in. White can play d4, attacking the e5 pawn, and you can go ahead and capture the d pawn with your e pawn. And if white pushes up their e pawn, kicking out your knight, jump it forward to e4. And if white captures your pawn on d4 with the queen, you can back up your knight with d5. And if they apply more pressure with the knight to c3 attacking your knight, what you can do now is move your bishop to c5 attacking the queen. And there's not too many spots for the queen to run to, but a good move for them is capturing your pawn. Now they're threatening the knight, and if they move the knight, then they're threatening the bishop, and they're threatening the queen, and it's currently backed up. But black has an excellent move, and that would be bishop f2, attacking the queen, or the king. The king only has two legit moves. It's got e2 or d1. Regardless of which square they go to, the knight can come in and kill the c3 knight with check, and that's removing the defender on the queen. So once white either moves or kills the knight, the white queen is hanging and up for the grabs. Cha-chang. That's a nice little doozer right there. That's a very nice little doozer. Well, I hope you guys enjoyed that one, and on to the next. This trap is a very good one, and Vishy Anand, the old world champion before Magnus Carlsen, actually lost to this trap playing as black. So from here, white will capture the e5 pawn, and black will push d6, kicking the knight back. The knight goes to f3, and now the black knight comes up and goes to e4, snagging your pawn. You want to go ahead and develop your other knight to c3, the Nimzowitsch attack. And black thought that they could back up their knight with the bishop, and that is a huge mistake, because the queen can come to e2 now, pinning that knight and adding an attacker. There's only two ways you can add a defender to that knight. First one being a pawn, but if you do that, then the pawn will just get pushed up d3, and the knight will fall next move. And if you think the queen will be a good defender and also breaking the pin, you can go ahead and jump your knight to d5, attacking the queen. And it wouldn't be too much of a problem. The queen would just be able to, let's say, Can't go here because the knight. Can't go here because it would get forked with the royal fork on c7 with the king, the queen, and the rook, because there's no way to defend the knight and this weak c7 pawn at the same time. So if they move it left to d7, you want to go ahead and then push your d pawn to d3. And even if they try kicking your white knight out of there, it doesn't matter. You just go forward and take the knight with your pawn that's on d3. Because if they take your knight, you can go ahead and take their bishop. And if they move their bishop, you just go ahead and move your knight back. That's a beautiful one, in my opinion. In this line, it's in the Stafford Gambit, and that is white knight take on e5. Black develops their knight to c6, and then white captures the knight to exchange on c6. And black wants to recapture with the d pawn away from the center, just like most of these traps, opening up the center. If white protects their pawn with pushing d3, you want to develop your bishop to c5. And if they pin your knight with bishop g5, you can pull a Eric Rosen, oh no, my queen. And if they capture your queen after you play knight to e4, you have checkmate. Bishop f2, check, one move. And bishop g4, le checkmate. That's a nice easy one. This is a deviation from the last trap we just discussed. If the knight takes on your pawn on e5, you want to play the Stafford Gambit and bring your knight to c6. If white exchanges the knights on c6, you want to capture their knight with the d pawn, not with the b pawn. You want to open things up nice in the middle. And if they block their pawn on e4 by pushing the d pawn, you want to go ahead and develop the bishop again to c5. And just like the last trap we discussed, when they bring the bishop to g5, pinning your knight, same thing. Eric Rosen, oh no, my queen. But if they know better and they try to block your attack because they know it's checkmate, they got a couple options. If they throw their bishop back to e3, attacking your bishop, you go ahead and capture their bishop on e3. And when they recapture with the f-pawn, you bring your queen out to h4, attacking the king. They got two options, to run or block. If they run, they go e2 with the king, and then you put your queen on f2 for checkmate. And they only have one move to block, that's pushing the pawn to g3, and that's when you capture the pawn with your knight, and it's no buenos, as they say for them, because if they capture your knight, you go ahead and snag the rook in the corner, and any other moves that they do is going to end disastrous for them, because if they don't move the knight, if they don't move the rook, you're going to pick up the rook in the corner. And other than that, it's a wrap. If they don't move the bishop back to e3, they can also try queen to e2. And in this case, you want to snag up their bishop on g5. And when their queen picks up your knight on e4, you just want to sidestep to d8. And they're basically worried about you pinning their queen to their king with moving your rook over to e8. So they're either going to put a piece between their king and queen or move their queen. If they move their queen, it's very bad news for them. They only have one piece to put between their king and queen, and that's even worse. If they do that, you want to slide your queen over to c1 with check, and they have to block with the bishop to d1, and that's when you can move your rook over to e8, attacking that queen. no matter what they do, the queen's going to fall next turn. They could always go ahead and take your queen or rook with their queen. But if they do anything else, even castle, you're just going to go ahead and pick up their queen next turn. Here's another trap for black in the Stafford Gambit, which is knight e5 capture. And you offer the exchange by developing your knight to c6. And if white captures on c6, you capture away from the middle, opening things up, not making 3 pawn chains. And if white develops standardly with knight c3, you want to develop your bishop to c5. And if they try the sneaky bishop to c4, you want to go ahead and bring your knight to g4, double hitting the f2. And they think they can get away with it with castling, and that is not good for them, because you can bring your queen over to h4. And for them not to get checkmated, because you're threatening queen to h2, they got a couple different tries. They can try pushing h3, but if that's the case, you can go ahead and take your knight and capture the f2 pawn, and you're threatening a double check. And let's say they try to bring their queen over to f3. What you do is you double check with knight capture on h3, and they must, since they're in double check, move their king. If they move their king to h1, that's the worst. Then you go ahead and bring your knight back to f2, another double check, so they must bring their king to g1. That's when you play queen h1 checkmate. And if they play instead queen h2, you go ahead and bring your knight, same thing, to f2. And now they got 2 options. If they run their king to g1, you got the queen h1 checkmate. And if they block with the queen, what you can do from here is bishop d6 check, and they can temporarily stall with pushing a pawn to e5, and you just take that. And now they got 2 options. If they block with the pawn to g3, then you go ahead and take the queen, and now they must move their king to g1. That's when you go queen g3 checkmate. And instead of marching the pawn to block, if, let's say, they march their king to, what was it, g1, you got the fancy pantsy knight capture queen on h3. And if they capture with the pawn on h3, then you have queen g3 check. They must go to the corner to h1. That's when you go to queen to h2 checkmate. And if they instead don't take with the pawn and they run to the corner on h1, then you have double check with knight f2. They must move their king to g1. That's when you play bishop h2 checkmate. And if they instead, that's their only 2 options, actually. So it's really no bueno for them. Other than bringing the queen out from this position, if they try taking on the knight with the rook, that's when I would recommend just capturing the rook with your bishop with check. And let's say they go You know, if they play king f8, then you just want to go ahead and bring your bishop back to b6, and now you're threatening queen f2, checkmate. And they're just going to have a lot of problems on their hands. Their king is wide open, and you are up in exchange. So that be that. And this last trap is out of the Stafford. Knight takes e5, knight c6, knight capture c6 in the exchange, pawn capture c6 from the d file, and here's where it comes off. White guards their e-pawn with pushing d3, and you push your bishop to c5. White is getting ready to castle, pushing bishop e2, and that's when you push h5. White castles, and you bring your knight to g4. If they push their h-pawn like the fishing pole trap, now you bring the queen out, looking to threaten checkmate on queen h2. And if the pawn captures your knight on g4, you want to recapture with your pawn, and there's very little that they can try to do. If they try to push their g-pawn, their f-pawn's actually pinned, so that would be checkmate right away. If they try pushing, what other options do they try having here? They can go, if they go bishop to f4, you just want to go ahead and capture that bishop, and no matter what they do, queen h2 is coming, or if they push g3, then you take g3 checkmate. I really don't see any other method for them to temporarily pause it. I guess if they push e5, you just take e5. That delays it a move. If they bring their rook over to e1, that's when you just put your queen on h2. And if they march over king f1, you go queen h1, checkmate. And I guess that'll wrap it up. And I hope that you enjoyed it.